Professor Walt, today people are growing more and more distrustful of science and super technology, and not always without reasons. So let's dispose of any suspicion of conflict of interest between your academic work and your business involvement. Please forgive the following question, but it is, why should we trust you?
That's an excellent question, Paolo. I would say that my own personal view of things is that I have to disclose conflicts of interest. We all have conflicts of interest, and I have significant business interests as a consequence of my entrepreneurship, but I keep those separate from my science. And the reason for that is that I think academics have one reputation, and they only have one chance to destroy that reputation. And so if you are dishonest and not reputable, people will find out, and then you've lost your credibility.
Very well. This interview will all be about what science does not know about CoV-2 immunity and vaccination. Let's start from the genome. I will quote to you Professor Wayne Marasco, a colleague of yours at Harvard. He said to me, quote, "Because the CoV-2 genome is so large, 30 kilobases, it's difficult to know if other COVID-19 genes are mutating and leading to greater pathogenesis." So the question is, what are the most serious gaps in the understanding of the CoV-2 genome today?
Well, Professor Marasco is the expert on this, and I would defer to his expertise in this particular area. But what I would say is that from the perspective of deficiencies in knowledge, it's simply that we just have not sequenced enough of the viruses from enough people. It's the biggest unknown from the perspective of the viral genome and how it mutates, and potentially how those mutations will change how we encounter the virus the next time it comes around, similar to influenza. But there is clearly a genetic component to this. Meaning that we see that, for example, the pathogenicity, the severity of the disease runs in families. Some families are very strongly affected by the disease, and others seem to be relatively only mildly affected. And it could be that there's just regional differences in the genetic makeup of the population as well.
Okay, good. That was one of the questions. Good. Okay, let's focus a bit more specifically on these immunity testing things going around. Dr. Lee Gerke, if I pronounce it correctly, a virologist and researcher and a colleague of yours at Harvard and MIT, said of the serological tests, quote, "We still don't know if the antibodies these tests pick up actually act against the virus," and unquote. And I doubled down with Dr. Alan Wells at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center that said, quote, "I would shudder to use IgM and IgG testing to grant an immunity passport to anyone. These tests are not ready for that." So my question is, these kits are being used now everywhere. What is missing here to make these assays truly reliable? What is missing? You're an expert.
That's an excellent question, and is precisely the subject of research that is taking place in my laboratory at Harvard Medical School. And so the missing link is the specificity of the immune response. So to the people who are listening and watching this, the virus expresses the antibodies. The antibodies that are produced by the host, by somebody who's infected with the virus, there are 4 different protein targets that the virus produces. And so antibodies can be produced against any one of those 4, and it's even more complex because there is a range of antibody types that are produced. These are the different immunoglobulins, IgA, IgG, IgM, and there's some minor ones, IgD and IgE. But in this particular disease, which is a mucosal disease, that is, it affects the mucus lining, IgA turns out to be important, IgM turns out to be important, and IgG turns out to be important. But each one of those different classes, there is a diversity of responses to each of those 4 proteins, that targets that are on the virus. And so nobody knows yet which of those antibody responses and which of those proteins is an interaction that results in what's called neutralization.
Right.
That is, not just binding to the virus, but binding to the virus in a way that activates the immune system to eliminate the virus from the body. And so that's the missing link right now. If you just measure the total amount of antibody, IgG and IgM, as you described in these tests that are quite pervasive, you don't get any information about whether those antibodies are neutralizing or not, meaning that they're effective at eliminating the virus. And so when the research is done to identify those individuals who have effectively cleared it and what the repertoire of antibodies exists in their bloodstream, then we will begin to get some sense of how we can really attack this virus, and perhaps even how we can generate very targeted vaccines.
Right. Yes, this has huge implications for social and labor situations in countries, what you just said. So basically, if I understood correctly, still technology has to advance quite a bit to produce a kit that really says you are immune or you're not. Okay, let's go on to vaccines, and we're almost finished. To vaccines now. Now, by the way, do you have wives, children, grandchildren, anything, if I may ask?
I have two daughters, and I have 4 grandchildren, 4
very
young
good,
grandchildren.
very well. Now, you remember the 2017 Sanofi and Zika vaccine fiasco. Millions of dollars were being spent for that vaccine, but then the epidemic petered out by itself. However, Dr. David Morans of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases then said, quote, "Vaccines are certainly helpful for controlling outbreaks, but viruses tend to flare up, peter out, and then pop up again." So here we are, racing for a vaccine for a virus that's ridden with unknowns, the immune response to which we don't even fully understand, and that could flare up, badly mutated any time. So for how long would you want a vaccine to have been tested before you give it to your grandchildren? 10 months, 24 months? How long to be safe?
Well, I think there are examples where vaccines are completely ineffective. We know Dr. Fauci, who has been taking the lead in the U.S. with respect to this particular pandemic, has been working on trying to develop a vaccine for HIV for nearly 3 decades now. But the success of those vaccines has been elusive. And so what I would say is the first thing that's going to be important is to demonstrate that the vaccine is actually effective at generating a neutralizing response. And then that has to be scaled to enough, a large enough cohort of the population to be able to show that it doesn't induce any undesirable side effects. Some vaccines, cause this antibody enhanced effect that can really be life-threatening and can cause death in some cases. So I would say specifically, I would say something like 18 months would be a reasonable expectation for when you could begin to vaccinate the most vulnerable members of the population who have not been previously exposed. But that would have to have taken place with considerable amount of testing in relatively large swaths of the population, thousands of people, to see, are there going to be some rare events of some bad things that happen.
Good. It's very important, Professor, that you gave us a parameter, because you know what industry is like. Maybe in 10 months from now, somebody would pop up saying, "Oh, I have the vaccine," and Donald Trump would say, "Oh, that's great," and so people will believe that's a good vaccine. And in 10 months, as you said, it's going to be very unlikely that that's going to be a good vaccine. So,
what I would say is that, if there are some indications of efficacy, the effectiveness of the vaccine, and that there is have not been serious side effects, 10 months, it may be that we really do have to begin to vaccinate some of the most vulnerable people, people that are extremely old, that we know that if they get the disease would probably be unlikely to recover, because the risk may just be better. The risk benefit analysis may just be at that level. But I would say that sort of in the conventional thinking, one would not want to rush these kinds of vaccines past earlier than something like an 18-month kind of time frame.
Yeah, because it's going to be very likely that legislators will force everybody to be vaccinated. So that's, it's important. What you're saying is very important. Now, we have 1 minute left.
Call following our guidelines and making the sacrifices required to overcome
I don't know what
this terrible threat more aggressively.
I don't know. Donald Trump is speaking to us.
It sounds like it.
I don't know what's happening. So again, to conclude, what's the single unknown about this virus that keeps you up at night?
At the moment, I would say that what we've already discussed, and that is the link between the production of antibodies by individuals who are infected or have been infected, and the protection that those antibodies serve. I think that, to me, is something that I'm frightened by the proposition that this passport back into society will rely on something that has at the moment no real scientific evidence to back it.
Okay, thank you very much for the interview. It's been very clear and very nice. Thank you very, very much. You're an authority, and we welcome you.